So today we're going to go over what I've discovered is the best way to replace and tune the trigger switch in an electric airsoft gun that has a mechanical trigger switch. So it'll look something like this. We're not dealing with a MOSFET or anything. These are just the old-fashioned mechanical type switches. So let's get started. Alright, so there we are. We've stripped the gun down to its basic components, and what we're going to be doing is replacing the trigger switch on this particular gun. The problem that we've been having with this one has been that it double taps. So when you pull the trigger, it double cycles rather than just shooting in semi-automatic, which in the airsoft arena is a bit of a problem when we only allow semi-automatic. So what we're going to do is replace this trigger unit. What usually happens with most of these is this little L-shaped doohickey on the side of the trigger trolley. This starts to get worn down and no longer gets grabbed by the cutoff lever here. So usually the easiest way to fix this problem is just to replace the trigger trolley. But for the sake of this video, we're going to go ahead and replace the whole trigger. So I'm just going to set that aside. First thing we're going to do is desolder our wires because we're just going to reuse those. So let's take care of that first. Now with the G&G style trigger switches that we have, they have these little loops that the wire can fit through, but the loops are usually a little too tight. So the first thing we're going to do is open those up a little bit. What I'm going to do is just grab a small bit and just work it into there. You could also probably use something like a dental pick or something like that to fit into that loop and open it up so that the wire can actually fit into there. The next thing you also want to do to prep these properly is to go ahead and score the metal surface so that it takes solder. So you want to scratch it up real good. Otherwise, if you've got a nice cleanly polished metal piece that you're trying to solder to, you're going to find that the solder won't adhere as well than if it is scored up. So we're just going to go ahead and scratch that up. So this is pretty much ready to go. We'll go ahead and solder our wires back onto it. So this will just fit through the little loop that we've opened up. Now you can take something and just press it down into the loop. You get a pair of pliers or just something metal to get in there just to press that loop down on it so it sort of clamps it in there. And then we're just going to go ahead and solder it back on. You want to make sure that when you're soldering these, you don't do it for too long because these are made out of plastic and you can melt them down if you keep the heat on for too long. So just make sure that the solder flows, that you don't have a cold solder joint on there, and that's really all you have to make sure that you do when you're putting these back together again. This particular one, I'm going to go ahead and just sort of crimp it down a little bit. This is going to fit into the other side of it through the loop, and we'll just press that down. And then we'll solder that as well. And that's pretty much it for soldering this part up. The problem that I've been having with a number of these trigger switches is the way that they set the contacts up on these. If you look at it, the contacts are sort of pinched together. this is really the whole problem that I've been having, is that you have to tune these a little bit in order to get them to work properly. So in order to do that, you're going to need a pair of needle nose pliers. And what you want to do is get in there and bend those contacts until they are perfectly parallel with each other. You don't want to have them bent outwards or inwards. You want them to have them just so that they're exactly parallel. And then the trigger switch will work exactly the way that it's designed to. It's sort of a little bit of a mystery to me why the manufacturer, when they're sending these out, are sending them out in that condition, because if you don't know to do this, you're going to end up with a lot of trigger contacts that are not working exactly right. So they don't work perfectly right out of the box. You have to sort of work them into the proper configuration in order to get them to perform as advertised. So now you can see the contacts are parallel with each other. That way, when the trolley goes in there, this little copper bit is going to fit in between those two, and that's what connects the circuit. For them to work properly, if they're pinched in too tightly, they make contact too quickly, and it can just go full auto because the trolley does not travel far enough into the trigger in order to have the cutoff lever pull it out and make it go back into its beginning position. So it's necessary for it to make contact at exactly the right point. And if those contacts are not set up perfectly right, you're going to see some problems with that. So this is probably the most important thing of this whole video, is make sure that you get those contacts set up properly, and then you'll be amazed how much better your triggers will work on the first try without having to screw around with setting them up any more than that. The other part that needs a little bit of tuning is the trigger trolley. In the past, I've done a lot of mods to these to get them to try to work right, and most of that was because of the problem of having the contacts being pressed inwards like that, which caused them to not work properly. And my workaround was to modify the contact on the trolley rather than changing the angle of these contacts. So lesson learned, it's actually much easier to do what we just did than to have to screw around trying to turn this into a little wedge. What I do like to do is make sure that the surfaces are nice and flat. So I like to take a piece of sandpaper and make sure that there's no bits hanging off of the thing, because this is a molded plastic piece, and sometimes there can be little pieces of plastic on it that can cause them to hang up. So you just want to make sure that all those surfaces are nice and squared off and don't have any kind of pieces hanging off of them. The other thing I like to do is give them a little bit of silicone grease on the surfaces that are going to be riding inside of the trigger switch. So I'm going to grease this up here along the sides of it and just spread that on there. And I've found that this does extend the life of the trigger switch. That's actually noticeable. So that's just going to slide into there. So at this point, our trigger switch is pretty much ready to go back into the gun. So we're going to go ahead and reassemble this thing at this point. So some of you may have noticed that I went ahead and removed all of the shims from the gears before I reinstall them. Reason being for that is I've come up with a new shimming system that's been working out pretty well for me, which is sort of a pseudo factory kind of installation. What I've been using is 0.5 millimeter shims on the bottom and 0.3 millimeter shims on the top. So as I install these, I'm going to put a 0.5 millimeter shim on the bottom of the gear. I also like to add a little bit of silicone grease to the shaft of it, and I'll install that. I also like to grease the teeth of the gears, keep that all nice and lubed up. Don't want to over grease it because then it'll just be splattering all over the place. But once again, a 0.5 millimeter on the bottom, a little shot of grease. And then we have our bevel gear, once again, a 0.5 millimeter on the bottom. with a little bit of grease, and then we'll just go ahead and reinstall the anti-reversal latch. And once I do that, then on the top of the gears are going to be the 0.3 millimeter shims, I should say, not bushings. So on the top will be the 0.3 millimeter shims, just like that. One thing that I found is somewhat important is to use the proper trigger with the trigger switch, and I found that some of the ones that are not made by G&G don't work 100% with the G&G trigger switches, because this little tab here, which grabs the trigger trolley and pushes it forward, on some of the aftermarket ones, this can be a little bit taller than the G&Gs. The G&G, you can see, is a little bit shorter than that. So the easiest way to tell them apart, to differentiate them, is the little hole that the spring goes into. The one on my left has an elongated hole, where the one on my right has a circular hole. The circular hole is the G&G switch. There are other manufacturers that do the circular hole, so that's not an absolute 100% kind of thing. So I also like to test fit the spring, or the trigger with the trigger trolley, to make sure that it's moving it all the way up to where it should be, and that it's not disengaging from the trigger trolley. You can tell if it's too short, where if you put this in and you press the trigger and it disengages and the trigger trolley snaps back. If that's happening, then this tab is too short. So it's not a bad idea to go ahead and test those before you install them. So you can see now we're back to getting regular semi-automatic and fully automatic. One thing I like to test with this to make sure that it's working perfectly is that it works both when you pull it very deliberately and when you pull it very softly. If it's not set up properly, when you pull it softly, a lot of the times it'll go full auto, and vice versa. Sometimes when you pull it really hard, it'll lock it into full auto. So if the trigger components are adjusted properly, that's usually the culprit when you're dealing with a gun that's not staying in semi-automatic. The other thing, of course, is potentially is the cutoff lever. It's a good idea to check the cutoff lever when you take the gun apart to make sure that it's intact and that the little tabs on it are all in place, so that that is able to perform its function. So there's really only a few things that can cause a gun to not function properly when it's going not staying in semi-automatic and going full auto on you, which is, once again, the little tab on the trigger trolley, that little L-shaped thing you can see on this one that I've replaced. It's worn off on the tip. That's a good indication that it's starting to wear down. And then, of course, like I just said, the cutoff lever can be worn out or broken as well. So, see, this gun is ready to be put back together and put back in service. And if you got any questions, if you're not comfortable doing this kind of stuff on your own, feel free to bring your gun in. I'll be glad to do the work for you. So until the next time, don't let the bastards get you down.